notes here. I don't know how long I've been talking, but so hopefully we have some questions that we can take, especially, okay.
One thing that is very important for me when it comes to characters, it's whether choose first-person narrator or a speaking narrator, one that has a voice of his own. I would like to ask you what you think about how do you make this choice, and what you think it's the advantages and disadvantages of a particular choice, a particular position.
The question was when you're creating your point of view character, do you want to do a first-person narrative or a third-person narrative? First-person narrative, the simplest way to describe it is I. You know, you have an active voice telling your story, like you're reading a diary. Today I did this, I did that. Third-person narrative is you have a separate narrator who's describing the story to the reader and telling you what the characters are doing. The first-person narrative was one that was used to be a very popular form. It's less common now, and I think the reason that it's less common is that it's a much more difficult way to write. It seems very tempting at first. I think that most writers, when they're practicing their craft, try it. I tried it myself. You think that, oh, well, I'll write my book as a diary, or I'll write my book as some kind of journal so that I can make it very personal. But what happens, the disadvantages of that, well, we'll start with the advantages of that is that it is much more personal. You can have someone reflect on their own personal feelings. You can have someone really describe what they're going through in detail and share very personal thoughts and very personal things that might be awkward for a narrator to describe, or might be less compelling for a narrator to describe. But there are also several disadvantages to this style. The first is if you're writing an adventure story, or one where the characters will be in battles or be in danger or things like that, by doing it as a first person, you're telling the reader immediately, well, you know what, they lived through it. They came through it and they came out okay because they're telling you this story. So if that's, it depends on the type of story that you're writing. With my books, I want the reader to feel like when something dangerous happens, that all the characters are in danger, that I could kill anybody at any time, because that adds a level of tension to the story that you can't get in a first-person narrative, because you know that the person lives to tell you the story. Whereas, you look at an author like George R. R. Martin, who can kill anybody at any time, including his main characters. Whenever he puts one of his characters in danger, you really get scared for the character, and you really get concerned that something might happen to them. You lose some of that with the first-person narrative, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because, look, in most books your main character lives through the story. It's kind of the way it works. With the same regard as I was speaking before, with when you have one point of view character, even more so with the first-person narrative, if you want to feed information to your reader that the narrator character doesn't have, you don't really have a lot of options to do that. It becomes very difficult to show your reader things that the antagonist is doing, things that are happening in different places, things that are happening outside of their understanding. So you're much more limited in scope in what you can tell. Now that doesn't mean that you can't, that doesn't mean that the story can't be done in this way, and there are certainly plenty of first-person narrative writers who do it to very good effect. Robin Hobb is a good example of that in her Assassins books. But again, she uses the technique that I spoke of before, where the character is sporadically psychic, just to make sure that she can feed certain bits of information to the reader. But it's a very compelling story, because you're right in the middle of the emotions of the main character, and you're constantly feeling what they're feeling. Patrick Rothfuss is another example. One of the few of the current, I think, crop of what I consider the grandchildren of Tolkien, the younger group of writers now. He's one of the only ones using that technique, and he does it very, very well. He tells a beautiful story that is done, you know, from the perspective of someone who's kind of retired and is telling the story of their life and telling of their adventures. And you know that they survive. You know that both the main characters survived because he's running it in at the time and telling the story to a chronicler. But you also know that something horrible has happened to him that's made him retire. And you don't know what that is. And you want to know what that is. And that desire to understand that about the character is what makes up for the fact that you know he survives. You know he survives, but you don't know that he's still whole. So I would say that if you are interested in doing something in the first person, it can be done, and it can be done to great effect, and it has some advantages to it, but overall it's going to be a much more difficult climb because you have those drawbacks of needing ways to feed information to your reader, needing ways to make sure that the story remains compelling even though the reader knows that the narrator kind of makes it out okay in the end. And also, but you can do that, again, Patrick Rothfuss gives the impression that the story isn't done. Even as his character is narrating, you can tell that there are things that happened, like the people that killed his parents, the events that are happening around the inn where he's telling the story. There's another ongoing story there that's not over yet. And so that too can keep someone interested. And so he kind of fluctuates between he does what's called a frame story. A frame story is when you have a brief scene of some people talking, and then one of those people starts to tell a story, and then you switch the chapter, and now you're in first-person narrative for a certain period of time, and then at certain periodical points in the story, you break the frame and stop and go back to that story that has a third-person narrator for a brief period of time, and then go back into first person. So there's really no limit to what you can do, and it's what you as a writer want to explore, what the challenges that you want to take that are the most important decision for that. It's just you need to be aware of those disadvantages and advantages before you start, because I know for myself and for a lot of other writers that I've met, they'll try to write a first-person book, get about halfway through it and realize it was much harder than they expected it to be, and stop and switch to something else. So it's perfectly all right to do it, and it can be done to great effect, and if you do it well, you would have the advantage of being one of the few modern writers that are doing it, but it's important to know what you're getting into. So that's my feeling on that, anyway.
Don't you think that having a narrator, a third person, especially the way that it's usually done, it becomes too much of an omniscience, and it can be a trap, especially for new writers?
Too much of a...
omniscience.
Oh, omniscient. Well, it depends. Again, that's dependent on your storytelling style.